Hello and welcome to the 2021 Urban Tree Festival. My name's Greg Packman. I'm the host this evening and I'm a steering group member of the Urban Tree Festival. The festival runs until this Sunday the 23rd. We're almost over, heading into the final weekend of what's been so far 7 days of fantastic and inspiring events with 2 days worth of events left. So don't miss out. Check out our website to book on some more events. The festival, although we're supported by some fantastic groups such as the Woodland Trust, Greater London Authority, Trees for Cities, CPRA London and others, we're a volunteer-run group and we're very dependent upon donations to help us fund and run the festival. So a huge thank you to anybody who has donated. If anybody would like to donate or donate again, then it's immensely appreciated and it's effectively what helps us deliver this festival. So tonight's event, one that I've been looking forward to the most, waiting all week, it's the London Plane versus the Hornbeam, a debate and discussion to determine the true tree of London. I won't be telling you why these two trees are head to head, that's what our speakers are here for. But just to introduce our two speakers, we have Mathew Frith and Paul Wood. Mathew is an urban ecologist and Director of Conservation for the London Wildlife Trust, with a particular interest in relationships between nature and society in towns and cities. He has 30 years experience of land management policy and practice in nature conservation, currently overseeing the management and development of the Trust's conservation work, developing the policy base to advocate for the protection, creation and promotion of a wilder city, furthering the Trust's research work. His favourite trees are the hornbeam and the sycamore. Very controversial second choice there, Mathew, but I very much approve. Tonight, Mathew is going to be representing the hornbeam as a true tree of London. Paul Wood is an author, dendrophile, and urban tree researcher, plus a founder of the Urban Tree Festival and Tree Talk, which if you haven't used Tree Talk, is a fantastic app. Paul is currently researching the great urban trees of Britain and Ireland for his next book, The Great Urban Trees of Britain and Ireland. His previous books include 2 editions of London Street Trees, London is a Forest, London Tree Walks, as well as the Great Trees of London map. All of them great books on London's trees. Paul's current favourite trees, because like many of us, it works on a rotational basis, are the London Plane and the Wild Service. Again, I very much approve of both those choices. Paul's going to be representing the London Plane in tonight's contest. So before we start, just a very brief couple of housekeeping points. The session's being recorded, so you can watch it again. I'm sure, like me, you will want to watch it again. We'll be having a Q&A session at the end, so please put questions in the Q&A panel. If they go into the chat, it makes it harder for me to keep track of them. If you do want to put general comments in the chat, please make sure you select all panelists and attendees, because otherwise it's default set to all panelists, so only myself, Paul and Mathew can see what you write. Other than that, I hope you're all... Oh, that's it, sorry. We're going to toss a coin at the start. So, Paul, your heads, Mathew, your tails, so toss a coin. Heads, so Paul, you are first. So take it away with the
wow.
Of the London Plane.
What a challenge. 2 of London's finest trees, and I've got the London Plane, which, as Greg said, is one of my favourite trees at the moment. So I'm going to share my screen and present the reasons I believe the London Plane should be crowned the true tree of London. So I think it fits in pretty well. Just wait for my slides to load in here. I think they're taking a little time to... Oh, this is the one I wanted to show you. So look at that. St. Paul's Cathedral surrounded by London planes. I'd say it fits in pretty well. This individual London plane is one of my favourites. They are not retiring trees. And this specimen, which is in Windrush Square in Brixton, despite being in South London, is my favourite London tree at the moment. They're huge, characterful, long-lived trees, and they define the city. They've taken the worst of what London has to chuck at them, and they've been doing that for centuries. That's pollution, conflict, climate change, the traffic of millions of Londoners bustling around them for generations, and they're still going strong. In case you hadn't noticed, London is a city as well as being a forest, technically, but it's a remarkably green city. It's grown up over thousands of years, and remarkably, some vestiges of the ancient wildwoods that once would have surrounded the city still exist, where you will find the wonderful Hornbeam. But is the Hornbeam really the true tree of London, or has it been usurped by the London Plane? Essentially, the city is a human-influenced environment. It is humans that have built the great edifices of the city. They've tamed the rivers and cut down the forests. It is humans that have influenced the climate, and especially of the city, to such a degree that in a phenomenon known as the urban heat island effect, temperatures can be 10 degrees higher in the city than in the surrounding countryside. So in that human-made environment, it seems appropriate that we look at a tree that is human-made. The bastard plane tree is one former name of the London plane. Platanus cross hispanica is my preferred Latin name, but there are others. And as I was saying, it is a human-made creation. It reflects, in a way, the melting pot of the city. It's a plant that was only made possible by human inquisitiveness. It's a hybrid between two transcontinental cousins, two species, one from Southeast Europe and Western Asia, the Oriental Plane, which is on your right, and the Western sycamore, or Occidental Plane, which comes from North America, which is on your left. You'll see that they both have quite similar yet different leaf structures to the London Plane, leaves of which are behind me. The London Plane is in between these two types of trees. The Occidental or Western sycamore is a tree which really doesn't thrive in London, and you'll be very hard pressed to find one. I think I only know of one example, which is in Battersea Park. The other one, the Oriental Plane, has been with us for much longer than the London Plane, and is a tree which is you will encounter much more frequently than the Western sycamore. These two species met as a result of human exploration and transportation and trade and colonial legacy of human interaction brought about them intermingling in Spain or southern France sometime in the 17th century. They hybridized, and a hybrid tree was the result, the hybrid plane or the bastard plane, and that is the tree which has become the London Plane. In London, there are some very old and splendid examples of London planes. They've proved to be very long-lived trees. This one is our oldest. This is Barney. Barney is an individual London plane that lives in barns. Barney is enormous. It's thought to have been with us since about 1680. It's still going strong. It shows absolutely no signs of decay. So there's no telling quite how old these trees can become. There is something of a mystery in them. Fascinating mystery, I think. Other old trees in the city, on the left is another picture of Barney, which looks almost like four trees bundled together, which there's some speculate it could be, but I think it's an individual. On the right is Barkley Square, another quintessential London landmark in the middle of Mayfair, which has London plane trees within it, which date from 1789, some of the oldest trees in the centre of London and the most magnificent. From here, I'm going to take you to Battersea Park. And Battersea Park was constructed in 1859. It's full of splendid old London planes. And these really date from the period of the Victorian expansion of greenery and the expansion of the city. And when it was the Victorians that loved the London Plane particularly. And it's their legacy that we appreciate now, with many of the trees that you'll find growing around London planted in that period from the 1850s through to the early 20th century. And so there are many trees that are around 150 years old, and these trees now define the city. So I think that's another reason to think about the London Plane being a tree that defines London, the true tree. But of course, the story of the London Plane didn't start in London. We kind of adopted it. It arrived, it became a Londoner, like many people. So human story is reflected in the story of the London Plane. This is a painting by Camille Pissarro from 1897. This is the Boulevard Montmartre in Paris. And Paris really was the city where planting of grand avenues of plane trees started. With, if anybody was on the tree webinar just now with Mark Johnson, the author of some great books about the history of trees in towns and cities, he was explaining how Haussmann's Grand Boulevards in Paris were the benchmark really for how European cities developed in the 19th century. And London, that wasn't lost on London, and London took the plane and planted it with aplomb. And London planes essentially were pinched from Paris, but now they fit in. They are ubiquitous, and they are the trees which are synonymous with the city. The Thames Embankment, the first place to really champion the planting of trees. This is in the 1870s. London planes were planted all along the embankment. They are there to this day. That was the moment that started the trend for planting London planes. And it's when that name came about, because they became so frequent throughout the city, they became known as the London Plane. They were exported, re-exported to other parts of the world, to New York, to Dublin, to other English-speaking cities around the world. And indeed, the New York City Parks Department uses a London Plane leaf as its motif. Surely London should be using the motif of a London Plane in our branding somehow. This is Muswell Hill. Again, Mark Johnson earlier was talking about the plains of Muswell Hill, an aspirational suburb of London, typical of many around London, where plane trees were planted to define it. They are still there. This is 120-year-old trees. But from there, I'm going to take us to South London and One Tree Hill. And here you can see, this is on a road, you can see the city glinting through the canopy of plane trees there. And the point I want to make here is that London planes are big trees with large leaves and giant canopies. The benefits they provide to all Londoners is immense. They soak up pollution, they moderate temperatures and store carbon. So London planes, I think, as well as looking great, defining the city and providing all these environmental services to us, are really one of the things that, one of the great treasures of London, and one of the things that we should think about as defining the city. And therefore, it is my idea, my belief, that the London Plane is the true tree of London. I'm just going to take you to Kennington Road, one of the finest London plane tree avenues in London. It's an avenue which goes into the centre of London from South London, that goes past the the Imperial War Museum. This is a street that was developed in the early 19th century. It wasn't tree lined originally. It was planted later on with London planes. Those London planes have been allowed to grow and for their canopies to reach this great size. And on a hot summer's day, you walk down this street and you really appreciate the cooling effect of this cathedral-like London Plane Avenue, this amazing natural phenomena, which really goes to show the effect that London planes have on the city, both visually and experientially, through the moderation of climate, through the pollution which they soak up, through the carbon that they store. And finally, I'm going to take us to Canterbury, bizarrely. So I'm, as Greg mentioned at the beginning, my new research project is about the great, remarkable British and Irish trees. And I suspect as I travel around the country, I'm going to come across hundreds of London plane trees that have become significant trees in towns and cities across Britain and Ireland that will be known as London planes and define those places as much as anywhere else. So the London plane is not only the true tree of London, it is the true tree of towns and cities throughout the British Isles and Ireland as well. So I think that is my reasons for why I think you should vote for the London plane being the true tree of London. And I think at that point, I'm going to stop and I'm going to hand over to Mathew and wish him the best of luck with the interloper, what was it? That was the Hornbeam. That was it, wasn't it? Yeah.
Thank you, Paul. I might as well give up and go home, but I'm home already. So interesting. His argument for putting the London plane as the true tree of London is the same argument that I would use for the ringneck parakeet as 21st century London parrot, the equivalent of the 19th century house sparrow being the kind of bird of the 19th century city. My take on Hornbeam is that it's a tree that people have largely forgotten, if ever they knew about it in the first place. It's such a tree that is underappreciated and often not known about. I don't think I really encountered a Hornbeam until my 20s. I learned about oaks and ashes and beeches and firs and pines and birches when I was much younger, and even London planes. But Hornbeam was new to me when I discovered it in my 20s. It's a fascinating tree, and hopefully my slides will move on. It's a tree that is part of the birch family. It is related to, as I said, birches, alders, and beeches, and it is often mistaken for beech, which at a very superficial level, it is similar. So in Epping Forest, we have these magnificent pollarded beeches, and to all intents and purposes, they look very similar to Hornbeam pollards. But once we look at the leaves, we'll see that the beech is smooth edged and the Hornbeam is serrated. And it's probably the most easily distinguishable feature of the Hornbeam compared to beech, but also like beeches, and I would say far more magnificently to most London planes, they can turn into magnificent veterans many hundreds of years older than London planes, because this is a tree that was here before London started. It had occupied the clay basins the city of London grew in from the Roman period, and the forested slopes of that basin were dominated by the trees that could cope with those conditions, which include oak and beech and alders, but also the Hornbeam. And these are just two examples in Epping Forest, again, arguably one of London's key forests. where at a certain age and through certain management processes, they become incredibly gnarled, muscly, a superb example of the kind of strength and resilience of Hornbeam. They were also, and I'll go into this in a bit more detail, recognised for being an incredibly important resource for London as London began to grow. And we have examples of the woodlands which were effectively planted by us to produce a crop of wood, which would then find its way into very important elements of our economy. The key element for me is the strength of the timber. It has a wonderful, what I call dreadnought bark, grey-greeny, which, as I showed earlier, is this kind of gnarled, kind of muscly feel about it. And looking and touching a hornbeam tree, it just feels so strong. And of course, that in itself gave its a name from which hornbeam means hard wood. So you have this gnarled look about its tree. There's the tree on the left is in Sydenham Hill Wood in good old South London. Those on the right there are one of the many coppices which have shot up at Rislip Woods up in northwest London. They are a dioecious tree, so we have male catkins which emerge early. This one is in Pimple Park in Waltham Forest, and these are female catkins which emerge slightly later in the year. This again is in Sydenham Hill Wood, and the female catkins eventually turn into these wonderful chandeliers, papery bracts, which are known as samaras. Again, a really glorious feature of hornbeam. And the seeds of those are a very important food source for a range of animals. And then in autumn, their colour, similar to that of beech, can turn into fantastic reds, russets, oranges and yellows. Again, another dimension of hornbeam which is often unappreciated. Hornbeams were managed to produce wood for various purposes. And we can see examples of these in many parts of ancient woodlands in London. So here are some ancient pollards in Hainault Forest in northeast London. Hainault Forest itself being one of the kind of remaining fragments of the much larger Epping Forest that went from London through into Essex. And then over on the other side in northwest London, we have a coppice still. So here the trees were cut, as many of you will know, at the base to allow a spring of new shoots to emerge, so that wood can be cut at a much lower level. Pollarding, as we know, was mainly done to prevent browsing by deer or cattle, but actually hornbeam is very good at resisting deer browsing. It's a tree that's not particularly favoured by deer, and so in many ways both pollarding and coppicing were useful ways for producing wood. So hardwood, in fact, hardbeam was one of its older names, and as Edlin said in one of his tomes in the 1950s, by far the hardest and toughest of timbers. Arguably, boxwood and hollywood are actually much tougher, but they're not known as timber trees. And it was for this purpose that hornbeam was used for machinery. It could take the stresses and strains of windmills, water mills, rolling mills, snuff mills, spice mills, linen pressing mills. So where the stresses and strains of kinetic action and motion could be really taken on board by hornbeam in a way that many woods simply cannot do so. And an example of this was in the cockpit in windmills and water mills. Hornbeam would never split, it wouldn't abrade easily, it would outlast things until really the Industrial Revolution started to replace all wood by steels and other metals. It was used for yokes for oxen, to pull ploughs, and later provide axles and elements of the wheels of wagons, again because of its sheer resilience. Pulley blocks in wharves, mills, and on ships, again huge frames that would split. And for domestic use, commercial use, in terms of butcher's blocks, we've got a French example there from the 19th century on the left, and a modern version which you can buy today for about 1,800 quid. Again, there was a good reason why they're used for butcher's blocks. And they were used for making the lasts of shoes, and in many ways fueling this economy until the Industrial Revolution started to make an impact. One final example here was that they provided the keys for claviers, harpsichords, and early pianos before, alas, animals were killed for ivory to replace the wood. But most importantly, in terms of London, the key reason why I think Hornbeam should be considered the tree of London is that it fueled London for several hundred years. When London started to grow, we used to keep ourselves warm. We used to cook our food using firewood. And then coal used to be taken down from the open coal mines on the cliffs of the Northumberland and Durham coalfields, down by ship up the Thames, and was used for a few years before the amount of pollution that it was produced meant that it was banned by the city elders. It was replaced by charcoal. Hornbeam has almost the most highest calorific value of any charcoal produced by any European tree. It is highly efficient in the heat that it produces, and it was used for cooking food, for keeping warm, and it was used for smelting metal. Charcoal kilns were basically built in the forests around London. So the Great Northwood, Epping Forest, the old Middlesex Forest up in Springfield Shades and Ruislip today, and of course further afield. Charcoal could be carried quickly and light because it's light, and effectively, I'm not going to go into a lengthy treatise of how charcoal is produced, but cord would be cut and then they will be created into these kilns. Examples here showing how they were constructed, effectively covered then with turf, and then they were burned. So the wood would burn very, very slowly in an anaerobic conditions, and the colliers, the charcoal burners who used to live in the woods, produce the charcoal, would look at the colour of the smoke emerging from those kilns to determine when the charcoal was ready, then be bagged up and then sold and taken into the city. But of course, the Industrial Revolution completely changed things by the time of the early 19th century, and the economic use of our woods basically fell away. However, of course, the hornbeam trees and the forests of London remain as heritage landscapes reflecting that old wood-based economy and became used for new purposes. City of London, for example, transforming Epping Forest not basically as a fuel powerhouse, but as a place for people to escape the pollution of the city, because try as they might, the London plains weren't able to counter the amount of sulphurous fumes coming out of the cities by the end of the 19th century. And people were encouraged to go to the green open spaces where those majestic pollarded hornbeams, oaks, and beeches provided that respite from pollution and producing that kind of amenity value, that escape from the stresses of the city. Paul eloquently talked about, is provided by London Planes and many other hundreds of species of trees in London today. Interestingly, Paul didn't mention anything about any other species because, as we know, London Plane is pretty useless to calling any plants and animals associated with it. Hornbeam, I will own up, doesn't have a vast array of species either. It doesn't compare well with willows and oaks, but it does have a biodiversity of its own. And here's just a few species in terms of invertebrates. We've got some moths which are directly associated with it. And we've got birds which will enjoy utilising the hornbeam by either nesting in the canopy, feeding on the animals, the insects that feed on the hornbeam leaves or the fruits. They'll feed on the seeds. There'll be bats that will rest in the nooks and crannies of ancient hornbeams. And we have one particular species which is very closely associated with hornbeam, the hawfinch, with a magnificent beak there. Its beak is so powerful it can collect cherry stones, but its favoured food is hornbeam seeds. But it's a species which is unfortunately in decline in London, and I don't think it's nested or bred here for at least 10 years. But of course, hornbeams primarily in London are associated with, well, certainly the old hornbeams are associated with our woodlands. And our woodlands with hornbeam in them, often associated very much with oak, sessile oak in particular, but of course an understory of hawthorn and hazel provide this fantastic biodiversity. And hornbeam are intricately associated with that. And because of that, we have us as people recognizing the value of these diverse wooded landscapes with their throwback, their heritage to when they were actually providing an economy for London, are now protected for their amenity value and for their value for nature conservation. So, for example, Epping Forest, which is of international importance, a special area for conservation, primarily for the ancient trees and the invertebrates associated with those trees, including hornbeam. We have Ricelet Woods, which is a special site of special scientific interest and one of London's 3 national nature reserves. Again, it's a very, very characteristic hornbeam woodland. The key predominant characteristic of that site. And then we have remnants of the old Middlesex forest, such as Stanmore Country Park. And then in South London, speaking up as a South Londoner, we have the old Great North Wood remnants, such as Dulwich Wood and Sydenham Hill Wood, but also the fantastic hornbeam wood at Bexley. Of course, like London Plane, people have played around with hornbeams too and have developed various cultivars for the urban environment. I saw a chat right at the beginning of the debate that's suggesting that the deciduate form of hornbeam is not particularly attractive. I use this slide. It's an old slide actually at the very beginning of the first steps of the creation of the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park in about 2006. As an example of how landscape architects often, in my view, denigrate trees by planting them in very unsympathetic landscapes. But again, hornbeam has become newly fashionable again. And whilst in some streets, this is near where I live, this is in Forest Hill, they are often brutally managed, as are some London Planes. And this is a street actually, which has got all deciduate hornbeam in it. It has become fashionable again as a hedging plant, because one of the other features of hornbeam is that certainly from the 18th century, it became a very popular plant to create hedgerows. And whilst it stands very well in mixed hedgerows with hawthorn and blackthorn, field maple and hazel, etc., you often get almost monocultural hedgerows, as this one here in Croydon, doing very well, I might add. And one of the reasons for that is that it often retains its foliage through winter, and for that is has an old name called A beech, which means everlasting beech, and where beech hedgerows often lose their leaves during winter. These are just a few quotes about hornbeam, just to try and recognise, to demonstrate that those that are passionate about trees and woodlands often do recognise what hornbeams provide and how important they are. But I would accept that they are not particularly well known across the wider public, and perhaps there is a campaign there. From a nature conservation perspective, I would certainly agree that if we had more hornbeams and we allowed them to grow mature so they could produce seed, then we would perhaps have more hawthorn. And then it does survive in modern 20th century literature. I've never read any Harry Potter novels, but this quote is one of those, and I'd like to think that small twittering birds were perhaps the hawfinches coming out of that one. But as some of you may know, I've got a fascination with street names in London and their relationship to the landscape in which London has evolved and either ignores or reflects. If London Plane was the tree of London, why have we only got 3 street names in London named after London Plane? Hornbeam, we have 16. Now the proportion perhaps is not that great in that difference, but it seems strange for a tree that is proposed to be and is called London Plane that we don't actually commemorate it in any way. We don't celebrate it in anything other than perhaps looking at it. So I lay my piece at Hornbeam being underappreciated, a powerhouse for the city for centuries before it got overtaken by the all-mouth and no trousers of the London Plane. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matthew and Paul. Two really fantastic and compelling cases. So kind of with the London Plane, we've got the modern tree that represents modern London, and then the hornbeam, the tree that the Greater London area was built off of. So yeah, we've had some really nice comments coming through in the chat about people like hornbeams and planes that people like. But I think we'll go straight to Q&A. So we'll do a few minutes of Q&A, then I've set up a poll so we can actually vote on what the true tree is. But in terms of questions, I'll go to you, Paul. There's 2 from Caroline Mayer. You said Barney looked like 2 trees, or maybe 4 trees, but is 1. Lots of the planes in Brunswick Gardens are doubled similarly. Are you able to explain the apparent doubling? And then also the burring and bulging on the trunks, is that related to disease or not?
Well, I think those are 2 separate things. So first of all, the bulging on the trunks isn't a disease. That is a natural phenomena, and there are several cultivars of London Plane which develop differently. So some of the more common ones, so for instance, there's one called Pyramidalis, which is a frequent tree, and as it matures, it loses its typical flakiness of the bark of some species. And the one which I showed at the very end, which is known as the baobab plane, which has that very short, fat trunk, that's another very unusual cultivar, actually. But that is very typical of how planes develop. The ones which have very straight trunks with very regular mottling bark is another cultivar, and there's one called Augustine Henry, named after a great plantsman who was connected to, I think, Oxford Botanic Gardens, and is the originator of one of the creation myths of London Plane. But that cultivar has a particularly straight and unrippling trunk. So that's quite a common feature, the rippling trunk. In terms of the tree being more than one, it's very difficult to tell. I think most are one tree, but you do see in some places, in woodlands and in some early planting, that there was something called bundle planting, where several saplings would have been planted together to try and ensure either a very thick wood in quite a short time, which you would be done in forestry terms. But in terms of unusual species, it was often done because they were worried about one of it failing. So if they had 4, it was likely that they might all succeed, or one might succeed. And you often see that with early ginkgo planting. So if you see early ginkgos that were planted in the 18th and 19th century, you often see them with multiple trunks, which is not typical of the species. And that's usually because they were more than one plant put in at the same time. It could be the same thing that happened with planes, but it doesn't necessarily appear to be. Barney, I think, is one tree.
Yeah, my theory, well, my thought was it was one tree. The Oriental Plane quite often has a multi-stem form. Could be, I could be wrong, who knows. Mathew, over to you. This was a question, I think, from early on in your presentation about the family that the Hornbeam is from. Someone saying, was it the same family as Beech or a different one?
I kind of got kind of gobbled that in some ways, in the sense that Hornbeam is part of the wider birch family, and it is part, and it's also related to hazel, but it looks very similar to beech. And in a sense, I mean, there's a where do you draw the line in the relationship? So it's not closely related to beech, but it looks very similar to it. It's more closely related to hazel.
Okay, great. So again, I'll stick with you, Mathew. Question from Helen, but maybe I missed it, but do hornbeams soak up pollution as well?
Well, most trees soak up pollution, and it's all partly related to the size and structure of the leaf. Unlike London Plane, which has one of the largest leaves that we have on trees in London, hornbeam is quite a small leaf, but it has lots of them. And a large mature hornbeam will have many thousands of leaves, arguably many more than London Plane. I don't actually know their performance in terms of pollution capture, but they are leaves which have got small amount of hair on them, so they are quite good at trapping particulates. What I'm less confident on, to be honest, is their carbon capture ability. They're relatively slow growing once they get past around 20 years.
Okay, great, thanks. One for you, Paul. You touched on this before, the sort of the creation sort of myth story of the London Plane, but is it any truth to the Oxford, well, the plane hybrid plane being first hybridized in the Oxford Botanical Gardens?
I think that's very highly unlikely. There's another, and I think that comes from Augustine Henry, actually, that claimed that, because he claimed that the two species grew in the Oxford Botanic Gardens, which of course is the oldest botanic gardens in the United Kingdom, dating back to the early 17th century. So I think that's a myth. I think in the 19th century, people were trying to think about where did this tree come from, and there was maybe some nationalism associated with it. They wanted this tree to be connected to Britain somehow, wanted it to be connected to London. They wanted it to be, because it was so successful in London, maybe they wanted it to come from the UK. But I think that we have to accept that that's not the case, because one of the parents, the Occidental Plane or the Western sycamore, the North American species, Platanus occidentalis, just is not a tree that will thrive in the UK's climate. And I think it's very unlikely that it would have reached maturity where it would be developing fertile seeds or developing flowering bodies. The other myth is that John Tredescant grew it in Lambeth, that it occurred in his garden from natural hybridization. But again, I think that's a myth. If you look at the records of the trees which they planted on the embankment, it's claimed that they planted Occidental planes along there, along with Oriental planes and London planes. So they mixed them all up. But I think there's a lot of mistaken identity in terms of the different plane species. As I say, I've only ever seen one Occidental plane in London. Oriental planes far more common, but even so, there's a lot of variation within London planes and Oriental planes, which can make them very difficult to tell apart. And there is one theory that London plane is simply a form of Oriental plane. So there is no concrete evidence of where London plane first occurred. It is a hybrid between these two species. It's likely to have happened in Southern Europe, where the American sycamore will thrive.
Yeah, it's got a very fascinating and intriguing history behind it. Nobody really quite knows what the definitive answer is, which I think just adds to the mystery. One for you, Mathew. I think this is a really, really fascinating question. Is there any commercial pollarding of hornbeams being carried out today?
I don't think there's any commercial pollarding, but there is pollarding being undertaken by the City of London, for example, in Epping Forest, and Woodland Trust at Hainault Forest. That is, I think, mainly being undertaken to try and maintain the longevity of the existing pollards. And there's again two schools of thought there, and Greg may have a view on this because of his involvement in the ancient tree form, is whether you leave those ancient pollards to grow massive pollard branches and then pollard them, 20 years later, or do you keep just regularly cutting them so they produce basically brash, and that brash is then just either composted or used around the woodland. There is very little charcoal production, and most of that uses chestnut, street chestnut in this country, partly because hornbeam is not a axeman or a chainsawman's friend or a woman's friend. It's a really hard wood to cut. It will blunt an axe very quickly. It blunts chainsaws very quickly, and therefore is not as popular. And you could argue one of the reasons that hornbeams became much scarcer from the 19th century was they were no longer planted because their uses were basically being replaced by other woods or metals and steels, as I said, in terms of machinery and construction, and in terms of fuel, it was coal. By the middle of the 19th century, we dug into coal seams that got a much better quality coal from those coal fields in Kent and South Wales and Midlands and the North East, and the railways were bringing it down very cheaply, and we were less worried about pollution. Hence, then planting London planes to deal with it, or trying to.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that. Yeah, one thing I'd sort of add to that, you mentioned why more than the ancient tree forum, is that many of the ancient hornbeam especially were what were referred to as working trees, as Mathew described in kind of their shape and structures, the legacy of that working history. So kind of that regular pollarding is something really, really important to continue. Even if we don't have the industry, then for the heritage and the cultural landscape, as well as the ecology, is key. Back to you, Paul, and I'm sure this is something that people will be noticing very, very much in the coming weeks. Why is the London plane tree pollen such an irritant to many? Are the polluting absorbent properties outweighed by its irritant factors?
Well, I mean, I think that's a good point. But the way I would answer that is that London plane irritant, it's not the pollen actually, it's as the fruits form a little bit of that, as they break up, the seeds disperse, I think is what it is. So it's not pollen. And it is very irritating for many people, myself included, and I do suffer from it during May. But I think it's a small price to pay ultimately.
Yeah, I very much agree. And a lot of my work has been underneath London plane trees, and it's not fun. It's really not fun. If you ever watch Trooping of the Colour, you can see all the troops in the army with their eyes streaming from being underneath all the plane trees. It's not fun. But back to you, Mathew. This is quite an interesting one from Mel Sutton. London shipbuilding history was a great consumer of wood. Did this include Hornbeam?
In short, mostly no, partly because Hornbeam, once it gets past a certain size, it tends to flute. So it basically, the bole of the tree, the trunk of the tree becomes more fluted, and that became very difficult to mill into straight planks and also, as I said, it's very hard. It's a very hard wood, and so oak was the preferred wood for most shipbuilding. There will be certain elements that would have used other woods. So, as I referenced in terms of the pulley blocks for the sails, they would have possibly been hornbeam. And hornbeam was used in the Weald very much to smelt iron. So iron would have been created, not necessarily locally around in London, but I said in the Weald, where there was a very big iron industry from the kind of 15th century onwards. And iron would have been used to produce nuts and bolts to help in terms of joining some of those timbers together when the shipbuilding started to really ramp up after Henry VIII set up the Deptford shipyards in the 16th century. So I don't think it had a huge role to play, but possibly a kind of contributing role.
Yeah, great answer. Yeah, a couple of comments about recording. Yes, this session is being recorded. It will be uploaded to our Urban Tree Festival YouTube page soon. We've got quite a few to process, but it will be going on soon. One back to you, Paul. This is to Victoria Tower Gardens, where there's the big memorial, Holocaust memorial, being planned for construction. But is there anything that can be done to protect the wonderful old London plains that could be under threat from the development in Victoria Tower Gardens?
Well, I think that's it's an interesting question, because protecting trees is obviously something which lots of people want to do. And when you see trees in public places, they often don't have protection. So, for instance, sort of thinking about TPOs, the tree preservation order, which is something which can be slapped on trees on private land, and it's a way of protecting trees in people's back gardens and so on, and that those are administered by councils and government essentially, whereas trees on public land don't get that protection. And I often think, wouldn't it be good to start thinking about an independent body that was responsible for tree protection. So another good example, in fact, another example of plane tree being in the public eye is the Happy Man tree in Hackney, which was a fantastic old plane tree and became a cause celeb. That was a tree which had been on the Woodbury Down estate, which is being redeveloped by Hackney Council, well, Barkley Homes and Hackney Council. And that tree was originally planned to be cut down, but when resident, and that had all been approved years ago when the master planning had been done, but then when residents realized that this tree was being cut down, they were up in arms about it and tried to stop it. And it seemed like such a great motif for the type of tree which ought to be retained and for developers to rethink their plans. But there is no body that can step in. So if you think about buildings, for instance, English Heritage is responsible for listing buildings. I kind of feel like we need something similar for urban trees or trees in general, a way of listing them, which is to do with public and privately owned trees, which is something we can all agree on and is something which planners can take into account when they propose developments which might compromise old trees.
Yeah, no, I very much agree. I do think there should be some kind of, well, there definitely should be a recognition of heritage status for an independent body. As someone who's a tree officer, for me, one of the bigger failings of TPOs is that they're overridden by planning permission on developments. So I won't go into it because we're on something else, but I do believe there should be change to it. So most of the questions that we have remaining are to do with the Hornbeam. So what I think we'll do is I think we'll go to the poll just while we've still got some time. So I'm going to launch the poll where you can vote. We can sort of settle the the discussion. Right, this is dependent upon me doing this correctly, so it could be a disaster given my history this week. Okay, so right, we've got 67 people to vote. Okay, we've got a few coming in for. Oh, this is getting exciting.
I should say that I ran a Twitter poll and there were 76 respondents and the vote was 74% London Plane, 26% Hornbeam.
Yeah, well,
I'm not resting on my laurels though after Mathew's amazing presentation.
Well, you know, it goes down to general knowledge, isn't it? General awareness. Some planes are visible.
So I think your followers, Paul, could be something of a biased sample, but who knows? So, but in a nice way, of course. Okay, so voting seems to have stopped. So that is Hornbeam wins, 61% to 39%. I think
a stitch up.
I think that was a fantastic effort, Paul. For me, this was, I couldn't decide either way because they're two of my favourite trees. They've both been a significant part of my career. So I won't lie, I'm very happy to see Hornbeam win, but I would have been equally happy to see London Plane. I think that's fantastic. So thank you very much for everyone who voted in that. We can go back to do some more questions because I wanted to get that poll done. So Matthew, very quickly, I'll combine two because they're both from Nancy. Where does the name Hornbeam originate from? And the Hornbeam seems to love twisting and turning as it grows. Do any other trees grow like this as well?
There were kind of two suggestions where Hornbeam got its name from. The one that carries the most weight is that it's Old English stroke Saxon for horny wooded tree. Because of its strength and similar to the strength of horn. The other one is that the beam relates to the yoke for putting over oxen when they were pulling ploughs and wagons, etc. But that's not really, you know, Hornbeam is only found naturally in England basically. Between a line from basically Weymouth up to Salisbury and then across to the Wash. Everywhere north of that line, it's been planted by us. it was a late arrival to Britain as the glaciers retreated, and it got here as sea level rose and we became disconnected from the main continent. This is why sycamore was late to the party and didn't quite make it, but is found in northern France. So that seems to be the root. It has many other names such as hardbeam, ironwood. In fact, the American species of hornbeams are often called ironwoods, again because of their strength. Lanthorn, which I showed a reference in one of my slides because it burns very well. So like lantern. It's also known as yoke, elm, and witch hazel, which of course are very different species indeed. I've seen other tree species twist and turn. It's often down to the conditions by which they are growing. London Wildlife Trust manages a site in Croydon called Bramley Bank, which is largely secondary woodland, but there's a fantastic tweak chestnut, which basically does almost like a loop to get around one oak and then falls under another oak, and so has tried to move away from that. And at one point it is growing laterally to try and find light. I've seen oaks do the same. But what hornbeam does fantastically is it does that in that kind of very gnarled kind of bark. So it does look that it has been literally gripped by a giant and twisted. And how it does that very slowly, very imperceptibly, is I think one of the wonders of its kind of our nature in London.
Yeah, it's one of my favourite. I just love looking at the trunks. I spent a lot of time working on the contracts in Forest this winter. I just spent the whole time staring at hornbeam. It was incredible. Sweet chestnut, of course, twists and corkscrews. But we've had what I think is an absolutely fantastic question coming from Helen Isles, which I think we'll finish on. So I think it's a really great question. Which two London trees will be debated like this in the Urban Tree Festival 150 years from now? I'm glad I'm not answering that one.
Can I start on that one?
Yeah, go for it.
Can I start? I think it'll be London Plane, because as Paul, I kind of implied, I think he implied, but didn't state, but I think Oliver Rackham, who is one of the great intellects on trees and woodlands in Britain, sadly now passed away, thought that London planes will become the largest trees in Britain in this century because they haven't stopped growing. The ones that first were planted here in other parts of the country are still growing. And unless disease hits them or developer decides to knock one down or whatever, they'll continue to grow. So I think that in itself is going to be an issue for London, in the same way that Tree of Heaven in New York is already causing problems, and it's also a tree that has a propensity to grow very large. I would like to see hornbeam still around in 150 years. There's no reason why it shouldn't be, and I think there's become a fashion to recognise hornbeam for what it used to do for London and what it can still do for London in the future. But I think I would be reckless to suggest it will be still seen to be a city tree in 150 years' time. I think we may have other species which will be planted here or encouraged here because of the increasing acute impacts of a changing climate. Paul referenced the urban heat island effect. It's 10 degrees hotter in centre of London than it is on the edge of Bromley or the edge of Barnet on a hot summer's day. That temperature incline is likely to increase. We will probably need different types of trees to help us cope with that.
I agree with Matthew in many ways. I think London Plane is going to be one of them, but maybe the other one, I'll speculate, might be one of two other species. The first one would be Dawn Redwood. I think that the Dawn Redwood has only been planted in London in numbers in the last 30 years. It's a tree which is being planted everywhere. Like the London Plane, it's a tree, we don't know how big it's going to get. We don't know how old it's going to be. And I think there are going to be some really big examples of that, and it's going to be almost as frequent as London planes are now. It'll be a ubiquitous tree. So I think we'll look at our London plane heritage, a tree which is not planted as frequently and hasn't been for several decades. We'll look at those as old trees in 150 years' time, and we'll look at the dawn redwood as the in the same way that we'll look at the London plane as we do today. Or if it's not the dawn redwood, then I think it might be the ginkgo, another tree which is being planted frequently, another tree which is very long-lived, becomes very handsome. There are some old examples. So for instance, one in Kew is 1792, but most are much younger. And it's a tree which I think we can rely on to survive as well, as it's survived for hundreds of millions of years already. I reckon that might just do it. So I'm going to go one of those, dawn redwood or ginkgo. If I had to pick one, ginkgo versus plane.
Yeah, I mean, I think ginkgo is, well, it's been around since the dinosaurs and it's still here, so good chance it will survive another 1,000 years or so. I suppose my answer would be trees that are very used to growing in very arid conditions, such as the Mediterranean species, or more sort of desert landscape, because they're very used to drought and poor growing conditions. And some of the areas in London that I know really suffering from drought, the trees that are doing well at the moment are Mediterranean species like hybrid turkey oaks, Montpellier maple, brilliant one in West Ham Park. So I'll close it there. Huge thank you to Paul and to Mathew for 2 fantastic presentations. I thought that was great. Very, very compelling cases. Yeah, congratulations to Mathew.
Up though.
No comment. But big congratulations to Mathew. I'll try and come up with some kind of trophy or medal at some point, an Urban Tree Festival medal. Yeah, commiserations, Paul, but a very valiant effort. Yeah, huge thank you. 2 days left of the Urban Tree Festival. If anyone's been to our Tree Rings webinar series, we have a fascinating discussion tomorrow on the philosophic value of trees at 1 p.m. Check that out, that should be fascinating. And Sunday at 2 p.m, a really exciting event on the politics of street trees. And then after that, at 3 p.m, a webinar, Tree Rings webinar on campaigning for trees. Paul mentioned the Happy Man tree. Today in the news, we discovered that the campaign to save the Bethnal Green mulberry has succeeded at this stage, which is great. That saved a threatened tree. And yeah, this is the sort of things that we'll be finding out more in the coming days. So a huge thank you to everyone who's participated, as well as to our panelists tonight. Have a good evening, everyone. Thank you.
Good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.